idea for today is the idea that God alone is big. And if God alone is big, guess what? That means you're not. Now, you might think, well, thanks very much, Warwick, for stating the obvious. But sadly, you don't hear that very often today. That God alone is big and great and powerful and majestic and holy. That God shares his glory with no one. In his book that John Piper wrote called The Supremacy of God in Preaching, he first wrote in 1990 and latest revision was in 2015. He says in there, it's still true that today people are starving for the greatness of God. Now, most people wouldn't know that, of course. They're too busy with other popular remedies for their troubled lives. But what he contends in that book is that what we need, week in and week out, is for someone to stand up and declare, "Behold your God." Now, John Piper's not the first one to say that, of course. In fact, we can go back 2,700 years to Isaiah and we find out that that's exactly what he was saying to the people. And so I want to just have a little look at Isaiah chapter 40 with you. And here Isaiah paints us some pictures of what God is like. He says in verse 9 of chapter 40, he says, "Behold your God." There are those words again. And then he goes through and gives us some ideas of the bigness of God. So let's have a look at some of these pictures. Take your hands and hold them like this. How much water do you think you can hold in your hands? Well, depending on the size of your hands, of course, it's about 300 mil. What about God's hands? This is what Isaiah says in chapter 40, verse 12. "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand?" Well, the answer is God has. God holds all the water in the world with one hand. That's about 1.3 billion cubic kilometres. God is big. Or how about this picture? The distance from the Earth to our nearest star, apart from the sun, is about 4.2 light years. That is, if you go outside at night, look at that star, the light that you're seeing is about 4 years and 3 months old. That's how long it takes for that light to travel about 40 trillion kilometres. Isaiah says, again in verse 12, God has marked off the heavens with a span. He holds up his hand, as it were, and he says, that's the distance, it's about that far. God is big. Or another picture. If you were to think over the course of your life, and I suppose depending on how old you are, think about how many people there have been who have taught you anything, or given you any instruction or direction. It just must be thousands and thousands of people, whether it's parents, school teachers, doctors, experts, sporting coaches, driving instructors, maybe Google, or here you are on YouTube, bosses, experts, friends, churches, so on and so on, hundreds and thousands over the course of an average life. And what I've come to is to get to that point in life where it gets quite embarrassing when your children start to teach you things. Well, how many teachers has God had? The answer is not one. In verse 13, who has measured or directed the Spirit of the Lord? Or what man shows him his counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? I mean, who? The answer is, of course, no one. No one in the history of the world, not one person has ever taught God anything. which means for us, perhaps we need to remember that God does not need your counsel or your advice. God has never sat down with anyone and said, I'd really like to know what you think. God alone is big. Another picture again. There's been a lot of talk over the last little while from different nations, all declaring different things. Self-important people making self-important speeches, each nation trying to flex its muscles and puffing out its chest. But God says in verse 15, "Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket and are accounted as the dust on the scales." It's as if God is walking along carrying a bucket of water, and bloop, out drops a drop of water onto the ground. God looks at that drop out of the whole bucket, that one drop, and says, yep, there we go. There are the 195 nations of the world. Or it's as if the dust on the scales, God blows the dust off just like that, and there goes some specks of dust. And that one floating over there, that's Russia. And the one floating over here is North Korea. And that speck of dust on the ground there, that's the US. God is big. Then in verse 16, Isaiah imagines the biggest sacrifice in the world. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. There's a pile of wood reaching right up to the sky, and it's made up of all the beautiful and valuable cedars of Lebanon. And then on top of this high and also very expensive mountain of wood are all the animals of the world. And everyone who's looking at this sacrifice thinks, whoa, hang on a minute, this is too big. This is too much. Isaiah looks at it and says, this is too little. Anybody who knows how great God is knows just how insufficient this sacrifice is. God alone is big. And we could go on, couldn't we? It was Charles Spurgeon who said, there is nothing little in God. One last picture to think about though. What we also see in this chapter is that the greatness of God is not just seen in his bigness or his power. His greatness, that which makes him a delight to behold, is also seen in his gentleness. Verse 11. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. The picture here is of tenderness and caring. The God who measures the stars in one hand also leads and holds his children in his other hand. God is big, but what does he do with his bigness? Well, he uses it to care for and protect all those who belong to him. Bigness and gentleness, power and compassion. There is nobody like God.